hello and welcome everyone along to this webinar on dismissing fairly, getting dismissal right and the cost of getting it wrong from SES legal patron Mills Selig. Of course, a very important and tricky topic. So delighted to be joined by Kiera Lee, Head of Employment and Partner at Mills Selig. Kiera has over 20 years experience in employment law, acting for employers in contentious and non-contentious matters. Her client list includes leading companies and large employers across Northern Ireland. So very happy to welcome Kiera along today. And just to say there'll be time for questions at the end. So please feel free to use the Q&A chat function there. And as I say, we'll come to those at the end. So Kiera, happy to hand over to you to get started there.
Okay, thanks very much. Cheery topic for a Wednesday morning. So a few elements to this, and because the topic is getting things right, I suppose that involves a lot of looking at what it's like to get things wrong. But starting at the very beginning then, so what does a fair dismissal look like? So a fair dismissal is one where it falls under one of the 5 potentially fair reasons set out in the Employment Rights Order, and we'll come to those. So there has to be a potentially fair reason. And on top of that, the employer has to be reasonable in treating that reason for dismissal as a sufficient reason. So 2 elements to it, and as you will see, each of those unfortunately is made up of a lot of additional elements. So the 5 potentially fair reasons set on under statute are capability, and that covers off obviously performance, somebody's ability to do the job, but also illness, so their capability to do the job as in that they're fit to do the job, and that reason covers both those elements. The next one is conduct. That can include a one-off element of conduct that is so serious that the employer is entitled to dismiss without notice, and that's gross misconduct, including gross negligence, and also continued misconduct that one item in itself wouldn't be enough to dismiss, but if there's repeated misconduct, then the employer may dismiss. Now, in those circumstances, the employer must give warnings, and the warnings should be live at the time of the dismissal, so they need to be relevant to what's going on. And also just to be aware that if in your company you hold anything really sacred, it's really important to you, and the company might consider that gross misconduct, whereas another company may not consider it gross misconduct, you'd be as well to include that in your policies and procedures. So if you have a policy that covers conduct or your disciplinary policy, you'd be as well to flag something particular to the company. For instance, there's a case involving Apple where an employee went online social media and said, "Oh, I've been having a nightmare with this app." So it was an Apple employee, an Apple app, and they said it's really messed up my time zones, 3rd day in a row or 3rd week in a row, and this is a disaster, rubbish app, or something along those words. And the employee was dismissed. And the reason why the tribunal found that to be fair was that Apple had very clearly set out in their policies and procedures that the reputation of their products was a core value, and that anyone breaching a core value will be considered to, be considered gross misconduct. So it's always good to reflect these things in your policies. Next, potentially fair reason is redundancy, and that covers circumstances where there is a cessation of work or a downturn in work. Very particular process to be followed around redundancy, so definitely double check your policies and procedures if you're looking at that. There are additional considerations around the requirement to consult with employees, so definitely something to be very careful about, but it is a potentially fair reason. Then statutory restrictions. So this is where an employer or an employee is subject to legal obligation, and if they do not comply or they do not have the correct paperwork or permits or things like that, then they can no longer do the job, or they can't be employed to do the job, or they cease to be able to do the job. And examples of that would be where someone needs a driving license. So legally you have to have a driving license to drive. And another good example is immigration. So the employee must have the legal right to work in the UK, and if they do not, then that will be a fair reason to dismiss. Good idea, again, in those very specific circumstances, to include that in your policies or the contract of employment or the letter of offer, which says, your employment is subject to X, either the driving license or the right to remain in the UK, and where this ceases, it may be considered a dismissal circumstance. And then some other substantial reason. So some other substantial reason is anything that's fair but not covered in these top 4 items. So good examples of that would be where there's a personality clash among employees and they just can't work together, breakdown of trust and confidence between the employer and the employee. It might be where a customer insists that they can no longer work with this employee. So lots of different scenarios. Reorganization is another one. So, but lots of different things. So it doesn't just have to be set out in your policy, and it doesn't just have to fall under one of those top 4. It can, as long as it's substantial, and then obviously subject to the overall requirement of fairness and reasonableness. So in terms of that fairness, so we have here our reason, so potentially fair reason, and then the next element is that the employer treats that reason as a fair reason. It's a good reason. So, and that means taking into account a lot of different items and the overall fairness. So in terms of overall fairness, it's split into procedural fairness and then the fairness of the decision itself. So procedural fairness is a real biggie. Employers don't, not that they don't fall down on the reason itself, but a lot of common causes for a dismissal to be found unfair are that they just don't get the procedure right. And it is very, very tricky. There are a lot of things to consider. So the first thing that anybody should look at is to consult their own company policy. So although there is a statutory requirement, tribunals will check to see whether or not the employer followed their own procedure, and they're often very scathing to say, well, look, that's the least you could do. You didn't even look at what you had written down to say what you were going to do, and you didn't do it. So the reason why company policy, it often follows the statutory process and covers that off, but sometimes there's extra things. So there might be a specification around time limits or who conducts the process. There might be the right to be accompanied, say, at an investigation, which isn't a statutory requirement, but employers may give it. And if you breach any of those, then the employer will find that the tribunal will find that the dismissal is not fair. And on top of that, you might actually be in breach of your own contract. So very important to check your company policy. Also, a lot of company policies give the right to suspend employees, which is not covered in statute either. And if it's a very serious offence or you believe there's some risk to the business, you may wish to consider a suspension, and that should be and normally is covered in disability dismissal and capability processes. So something you take a look at and be very careful around any decision to suspend, because it isn't automatic and there should be a really good reason for it. So unless there's some risk to the business or relationships among employees, then you shouldn't automatically jump to a suspension. Also be aware now with heightened responsibilities around mental health and protecting your employees' mental health, that even the person who has potentially conducted themselves poorly still are entitled to be supported from a mental health point of view around any disciplinary process, particularly where they are suspended and perhaps isolated. So if there's anything within the company support in terms of external help or counselling or things like that, they should be signposted to that. So policy is first preparation. The next thing to consider is the statutory situation. Now it's called, and you often hear it described as the statutory 3-step process. It is far from 3 steps but this is the minimum 3-step requirement, which does involve a lot of other elements to it, but it's a good way of remembering what the absolute basic requirement is. And if this requirement is not followed, the tribunal will consider the dismissal to be automatically unfair, which means the employee doesn't really have to show that the reason was unfair, or you know, that you failed to do anything else. If you have not followed these 3 steps as a minimum, it will be automatically unfair dismissal, and that would result in a minimum payment that the tribunal will consider, and also potentially an uplift in the overall payment. So if there's a substantial award, the tribunal can up that by 50%, which could be really significant. So whatever you do, these steps are minimum. So the first of the steps is that you're to provide the employee with a statement of grounds for action and an invitation to a meeting. Now, involved in that is very clearly setting out the allegations and also any documents you wish to rely on in relation to the allegations. You should set out, confirm that it is under the disciplinary process, and provide a copy of your policy to the employee. You should make it clear what the potential sanctions are. So if it's only up to final written warning, then say that. But if it has the potential for dismissal, it's very important to include that. You will see later on in the case law that that is a potential pitfall for not doing that. Then you would give the employee the right to be accompanied. You would say who is conducting the meeting, and make sure that you give time between the invitation and the meeting itself. Generally speaking, the guidance is about 3 days. I would say if you have 2 full, clear working days, that's okay. So invitation on 1 day, 2 days, and then the meeting on the 3rd day. So that's really what they mean by 3 days. And then in terms of the meeting itself, then obviously the employee will have had the right to be accompanied. And if you set up your invitation really well, and you set out your allegations and the information that you're going to rely on, then the meeting kind of follows that format and sets out for itself what needs to happen. And you should make sure at the meeting that you go through the allegations and give the employee the right to respond to each of them. And then a round up at the end to make sure, is there anything else you want to add? Are there any other documents they want to put forward, any other information they want to put forward? And then if there's any other, which there shouldn't really be, but sometimes issues arise at these meetings that you have to go off and investigate it, make it very clear, you know, what the next steps are, whether or not you are going off to double check something or interview another witness or get another document, or whether or not the next thing for them to expect is the decision. So the decision should follow the meeting, and there is no requirement under the legislation to put the decision in writing, but employees are also entitled to ask for reasons, for written reasons for dismissal. So the process and the good practice tends to be that you do put this in writing. In terms of the timing of that, again, there's no specific timing, but there's often complaint at tribunal where employees say, well, they didn't even consider what I said because they made the decision in the meeting or straight at the end of the meeting, or they took 5 minutes to decide my future. You know, I would advise that the decision is not taken on that day, or if the meeting is in the morning, you know, don't issue the decision until late into the afternoon, because you need to at least give the show and the appearance of having taken time to consider that, and confirm that in writing, and then backing up your decision and why you've reached it, and then giving the right to appeal. So the appeal meeting really should be conducted by someone more senior. The process of the appeal is not to start again from scratch, so there doesn't have to be a full new investigation. The person doesn't have to interview the witnesses or whatever. I always like to think of it like the appeal person is really checking the other party's homework. So they are checking that the investigation was fair and reasonable and covered anything it should do. They investigated any witnesses they should. They got the information out of the witnesses that they should. And then, you know, that the person conducting the disciplinary took into account all the relevant information, and that they were, I suppose, in possession of that information, and whether or not they should have done anything differently or weighed too heavily on one part or whatever. But it's not really for them to remake the decision. It's just to check the decision is fair and reasonable, or if there's any other reason for changing the decision. And sometimes you do have to go off and reinvestigate or double check a fact, or something new comes up, and that's fine. But generally speaking, you know, it is the whole reinvestigation and rehearing of every point. We try and get employees tied down to why they're appealing and in what grounds, but I would say in over 90% of the cases, the employees just say, I'm just appealing everything. You know, they just want it all looked at again. They think the whole thing's unfair. But sometimes, you know, they will come back and say, well, it was just too harsh. I agree, I did it, but it was just too harsh. So in those circumstances, I suppose you're looking at the reasonableness of the decision. But just as long as there's evidence that it has been looked at, and notes of why the appeal manager or chairperson has come up with the decision either to uphold the appeal or not. So on top of this 3-step minimum, there are also the general requirements of the statutory process, and I suppose these are more like principles, and they sound like common sense, but it is always good to have them in the back of your mind. So there should be no unreasonable delay, and there may be something in your company policy. When I'm drafting policies, try to shy away from this, setting out all very specific time limits, because, you know, even with the best will in the world and the company has all the resources in the world, things never go according to plan. So, you know, to say 5 days from the investigation, we will then decide about the disciplinary, but, you know, somebody could be on holiday, or you might have to go and speak to an external provider or something like that. So I would avoid very specific timetables. And I think the key for avoiding complaints around that is to keep the employee informed. So especially if they're on suspension, you should check in regularly and say, look, we're still doing this, or we're still doing that, we have someone else to speak to, or the manager's on holiday or whatever. Just keep the information flowing, and that will avoid complaints. Delay is a massive issue when you get to tribunal, and it can render what would otherwise be a fair process. So even where you're really thorough, if it's been a great delay, then, you know, it could be found to be really unreasonable and render the dismissal unfair. Reasonable timing and location of meetings. So you'll see if you're interested at all, if you read some of the case law around this, you know, employers try to rush things through, which I totally appreciate, but I'm always saying, put the brakes on. That has to be reasonable. You know, you can't send an invitation for them to come that day, and, you know, sometimes there are things at risk, and employers will take a view on that. So maybe there's information going missing, or something of commercial importance that needs to be protected, but where possible, and it's reasonable timing. So you have to be able to justify why you're doing what you're doing. But generally speaking, unless there's any particular set of circumstances that would require otherwise, then you should leave a couple of days between the meetings. And then the location of meetings. So something we can look at in terms of adjustments, but, you know, a meeting in the middle of an office in a glass box where everyone can see, you know, the employee may consider that to be unfair, and tribunal would probably consider it to be unfair as well. So just be careful, keep it discreet, keep it confidential, don't have it too far away, that type of thing. And always important to allow the parties to explain their case, and that's both parties. So employer really has to set out what they mean. You know, what is the allegation? Why do they feel it's gross misconduct? That type of thing, and then allowing the party to reply. And there we have that point at the end about appeals being heard by a more senior manager if, and the test is if reasonably practicable. So in smaller businesses, it may be only one director or one manager, and it is okay for them to conduct both meetings, both the disciplinary and the appeal. But if that is the case, then there is a higher burden for them to set out to show that they did reconsider it and what they looked at when they were reconsidering it. And I would say that should either be noted somewhere or put into the appeal decision. Some employees say that employers are obliged to get independent people to hear the appeal. That's not correct, but employers shouldn't be quick to jump to say there is no one else. You know, there might be a non-exec director or you know, related business or someone trusted that could come and do it. So, you know, think outside the box in terms of if it is a small business, who else could potentially do it for you? And if that's the case, then you might want to keep those people, you might want to keep the pay for yourself and have that other trusted person do the dismissal so that you have the ultimate say. And under procedural fairness, don't forget the investigation. This is a tricky one because all disciplinary dismissals should start with an investigation, but it isn't mentioned in the three-step process, so it's a bit back to front. But I put it here just as a very pertinent reminder that, you know, it can't be forgotten even though it isn't mentioned anywhere in the process. So there is a requirement to carry out an investigation in all circumstances, even if they're small, even if it's pretty obvious. And an investigation, a good investigation, might actually avoid disciplinary, further and formal disciplinary meetings, but they may also lead to, you know, dealing with something informally, or realizing that there's a need for training, or that there is someone else involved. So a good investigation really can and does lay the groundwork for a good, thorough process, and maybe avoiding the process altogether. So where possible, again, there should be a different investigator than the person who conducts the disciplinary meeting itself. In terms of the investigation, although there is no right to be accompanied, as mentioned, it might say under your internal policies that there is a right to be accompanied, so double check that. Some of the LRA and ACAS suggest that it is a good idea to allow people to be accompanied. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. You don't have to give any particular notice for an investigation. Sometimes you want to just move things on quickly and you don't want to wait. It's important that, you know, you get immediate responses, and, you know, while the evidence is fresh, and also to see, you know, if you're testing the truth of some allegations, you know, to get people's real-time response to these things. So investigations are not, no notice is required, and you might not want to wait around for allowing someone to be accompanied, but if it's in your policy, you should do. Then the investigation is just a reminder that it's not a disciplinary process in itself. So the investigator isn't making any decision around guilt. They're just making a decision as to say, right, this is fact finding, here's what I found, and based on this, it looks like there might be something in it, and then they pass it on to the disciplining officer to formulate the allegations and to go ahead with the disciplinary. An investigator can make recommendations, so they can say, I think this should go on to disciplinary, or I don't think it should, or perhaps this could be treated informally, or this is a training issue, or whatever, and it might go no further. So they do have some decision-making powers, but they're not deciding on the guilt as such, if it is and requires a formal investigation. Again, big complaint by employees and in tribunal that, you know, it's predetermined because the investigator has said this person is guilty, they did X, Y, and Z, that type of language. So sometimes it's more about language than anything else. So just be careful around that. The investigator should, in fact, prepare a report. Good idea to have that written, and then everybody knows what was looked at, what evidence was considered, and what any recommendations were. And then that report can be used as a basis for the disciplinary letter and the allegations going forward. So, let's go on to the next slide. Making the decision then. So we've talked about the process and why that's important, to procedural fairness, and the fact that the breach of procedural fairness makes it automatically unfair, can lead to an uplift in any compensation that's awarded. But also important is the decision itself. So obviously it has to be something that someone would be dismissed for. So it can't be something really minor unless it's a repeat of minor offences. And the test for deciding whether or not it is reasonable is known as the range of reasonable responses test. So there isn't one right answer. So something might be very important to my organisation and I would consider it gross misconduct, and then another organisation may not. So in those circumstances, you know, there is this range of how someone would react to the circumstances, and the tribunal only have to look and see whether it was something within the range of how someone would have reacted, not that you definitely should react this way or you definitely shouldn't react another way. So I suppose it means that decisions can still be harsh, but still be reasonable and found to be fair. And it's not up to a tribunal themselves to decide that whether or not they would have dismissed in the circumstances. It's that particular employer in that industry, in those circumstances, with their values. So it is a very personal decision. But what I would say is, when you're considering it, you know, if it is on the cusp of being harsh, you know, maybe just take a step back, or you know, run it past someone else. It would still ultimately be the disciplining officer's decision, but maybe good to take a bit of advice from HR or another manager, you know, to see whether or not you feel that you're in the right zone in terms of the reasonableness, because it might be very particular to you, and you know your values, you would find it's reasonable, and someone else may not. So just good to do a bit of a sense check on that. So when making the decision and coming to decide whether or not it is reasonable, you would review any aggravating factors, and I would say you should probably make a note of anything you are considering. So for instance, you know, if it is the person is a really senior manager and they should have known about this particular thing that they did wrong, you know, that's going to make things worse than someone really junior who wouldn't maybe be expected to do this in the same way, or, you know, to have a particular skill or to have known about a particular policy. So aggravating factors might be seniority, or it might be, you know, that it was brought to their attention before, or those types of things. And then also it might be things like how they behave in the disciplinary, you know, were they straightforward? Did they lie? That is usually a major aggravating factor for an employer deciding, well, you know, they couldn't be straightforward about it. So, you know, that really swayed my decision. And then on the other side, review any mitigating factors. So seniority, again, might actually be in their favor. You know, they've been there a long time, and they're valuable to the business, and they have a clean record. So always review their HR record and their length of service. And, you know, if they've been a very good servant for 20 years, then that may work in their favor. And also then to consider whether or not there's any alternative to dismissal. This might be particularly relevant in performance or illness, where if there's someone that's not capable of doing their job, there might be another job for them to do, or you could reduce their hours, or see whether there's anything else that you know, a demotion or that type of thing, because a dismissal should always be a last resort. So common problem areas where employees fail to turn up to meetings, often get phone calls to say the employer's all prepped and the person hasn't turned up and they haven't provided any explanation. I always say, give them another chance, write out to them and make sure it's very clear to them that if they do not turn up to the next meeting without any explanation, that a decision will be taken in their absence. And then in those circumstances, if they fail to turn up again, you just go through the process as if you would. So you go through the allegation and the information you've got and really make a note of having done that and what you find on each allegation that's within your knowledge, and come to your decision at that point. The employee goes on sick leave. This is probably the single most frustrating issue for employers and very difficult to manage. There are some things you can do. So often in response to an allegation of misconduct or performance, the employee goes on sick leave, and, you know, it's just to avoid having to face it. So obviously you can't jump in straight away. If employee goes on sick leave, you have to give a reasonable period of time for them to come back. I would say that's pretty short, I suppose, depending on the sickness. But if it is stress related or whatever, I would give it a week or a couple of weeks, make contact and say, look, you know, you've gone off. Obviously, it's a very stressful situation. Nobody wants to face disciplinary, but it's in everybody's best interest that we get this done quickly. And then you could even agree that it could be done over the telephone, it can be done off-site, it could be done in writing, and try and make some adjustments and get the person to engage. And if they continually fail, you might have to then get occupational health advice to say that they are fit to attend a meeting, and maybe not fit to attend work, but are fit to attend their meeting and address the allegations and go from there. And if they still, even if you have all that and you've tried all those alternatives and try to be reasonable about circumstances in which the meetings take place, etc., then and only then would it be reasonable for you to proceed in their absence and make a decision. So there is a bit of a process around that, but it doesn't mean that the minute they go off sick, you have to just sit and wait till they come back. You know, you can actively manage it. There are some things you can do, but I appreciate it's really not easy. Grievances during the process. I suppose whenever the statutory process came in, there was very much a discussion around we have to halt the process every time there's a grievance, but case law sort of has developed this, and there isn't a requirement to just pause the process in every circumstance. So grievances often relate to the process itself, or they don't like the manager, or the manager's got it in for them, or somebody else did something and they're being picked on, and this type of thing. So if it relates to the process, you can nearly isolate the element that they're talking about. So if it is that somebody else has done something or somebody's lying, you say, well, look, that will all be dealt with as part of the process. We take your notes on that and we will investigate that element of it as part of it. If it's that they don't like the manager, you've got a choice there. You know, if there is any evidence of the manager having been there being a difficult relationship or whatever, then you'd be safe to swap managers. Not that you'd necessarily be dictated to by the employee, but better to be safe than sorry. And also it avoids you having to investigate that. If you just say, okay, fine, we don't necessarily accept what you say, but just, you know, in the sake of fairness and to make sure you're satisfied, we'll swap and have a different manager. There may be some circumstances in which grievances are investigated, but it may be that they can be taken off to the side and investigated at the same time. So it wouldn't always be the case that you would have to pause that, go off and do your grievance investigation and then come back. But you need to be very clear about what the process is and how the grievance is being dealt with, so that there's no misunderstanding. And then make sure before any decision is made whether if you have to take into account something that they've raised as part of a grievance. So for instance, you know, they may say, well, I wasn't given training on such and such a thing. So just double check at the end that that has been taken into account in any decision. Dismissal during probation periods or short service dismissal. So for Northern Ireland, that is less than a year. In the UK, that's less than 2 years. The short service, that is. So someone who has less than that service is not entitled to bring a claim for unfair dismissal. And dismissal during probation, they often fall into the one category, but they are slightly different. So during probation, some contracts say we don't have to follow the process. The advice all around, strictly speaking, is that you should follow the process anyway, because you never know if someone has an underlying protected characteristic or reason for, you know, why they're not performing, etc. And it may come out in the wash that there's a disability, or they're being bullied, or they're being harassed, or for whatever reason. And then you find that you're in a situation where actually they have the right to bring an unfair dismissal claim because of this protected characteristic, because you don't need the 1 year service to do that. And then you're in a situation where you're in the automatically unfair territory because you haven't followed the process. So what I would normally say to employers, look, if there's no sense of them being able to tie it to any protected characteristic, then you don't necessarily need to follow process for less than a year or for probation. But if there's any hint of a disability or some form of harassment or bullying or some other protected characteristic that they are saying that this is impacting them, then I would say follow process, and you'll be able to determine that the dismissal is not for the reason they are saying, but is a fair dismissal, and you will have followed that process if they then bring a claim for unfair dismissal on the grounds of that protected characteristic. Disabilities and reasonable adjustments. Hopefully you would be very aware before you embark on any process if someone has a disability and that there was something required of you in terms of the process or in terms of the reason for the disciplinary. So it may well be if you're carrying out a performance process, performance dismissal, that the employee, their performance issues are relating to some form of disability. You should hopefully be aware of that. But if it arises during the process, you need to stop and rethink, because on top of any failure to allow for these issues, then you would not have followed a proper process. You would have a disability or other discrimination claim. So in terms of reasonable adjustments of the process itself, you would maybe consider whether or not they need to be accompanied at all stages, even investigation, whether they be accompanied by someone other than what it says in your policy. So most policies say either an employee, colleague, or a trade union rep. You may allow a member of a family or a medical expert. No requirement ever to allow legal advice. It would only be in very extreme circumstances, a career-ending situation, that you might consider giving someone the right to put forward any legal or have anyone legal at any meetings. But also for disabilities and reasonable adjustments, you might consider that things are done in writing, or that they are done outside the office or at the employee's home, or really what you can agree between you. And you should hopefully be aware in advance, but if not, you might have to get an occupational health report confirming to you what is reasonable in those circumstances and what adjustments need to be made to allow you to continue with the process. And then the other problem area is the harshness of decisions, and I probably covered that a bit in terms of just speaking to a colleague or getting some advice, making very clear that you're still making the decision, but a sense check on those decisions that are on the cusp of whether or not they are fair. And if you've considered that tribunal and show that you've considered it, and that you've documented very clearly your reasons, then you're in with a better chance of tribunal considering that the decision is overall fair. Costly mistakes, these are all from case law, and some of them are very pricey indeed. One of the awards was uplifted to £120,000 for complete failure to carry out any investigation. So we said earlier that if you fail to follow the minimum 3-step procedure, it's automatically unfair, and there's a minimum of 4 weeks pay. So even if it's found that the decision itself and the reason is completely fair, but you haven't followed the process, then although the employee may not get ongoing loss of earnings or the compensatory award, they will still get a minimum of 4 weeks pay. And then potentially, if the reason itself is unfair, they will uplift the compensation by between 10 and 50%, just depending on the level of failure, 50% being the most. But that can really be a hefty uplift, and definitely worth having a few meetings for. So not allowing the employee a proper opportunity to respond. These are all pulled from case law and where uplifts have been awarded. So that one was a meeting where went in, gave the allegations, and the employee was just talked over throughout the meeting, and clearly wasn't given the opportunity to explain why they had done what they had done, or ask questions or do a roundup at the end of anything else they wanted to rely on. Failure to carry out a reasonable investigation. In those circumstances, there were witnesses who were not spoken to and evidence that wasn't gathered. Dismissal without warnings. So that was where the dismissal itself was based on quite a minor performance issue, and the employee hadn't been given a warning before. So what had happened was there were informal warnings, meetings where they said, this needs to improve, but the employee was never advised that these were being noted somehow, and then they were pulled in to a final process for something quite minor and dismissed, even though the warnings were not technically in place. So a warning should be very clear. It should say, this is a warning, it's going to be recorded, this is how long it lasts for, and what happens if there's a repeat of the offence. Dismissal without a hearing, that's probably pretty obvious, that you have to have this hearing, but sometimes there are meetings and the employee isn't aware that it's a disciplinary hearing, or sometimes there's 3 or 4 meetings and it's not clear if they're investigations or whatever they are. So always very important to follow up any investigation process saying, right, we're now moving to a disciplinary event. Failure to obtain or provide witness evidence, very similar to the reasonable investigation above. Failure to advise that the action was disciplinary. So this is a technicality, but actually comes up quite a lot. So that's why in our letter we would say, we're inviting you to a disciplinary meeting, and this is the potential outcome, and this is a potential sanction. And then the last one was spurious and vindictive disciplinary process. So this is where an employer appeared to just make up a reason for dismissing employees who were pregnant, and the dismissal was found to be unfair because no reasonable employer could have considered that these were things to reasonably take action on. And as I say, it was the failure to obtain or provide witness evidence was the £120,000 it was uplifted to. So there were a few other elements in there, but definitely very significant sums involved, and 50% can make a real difference to that. And I suppose the other cost of this is reputation. A few high profile cases in Northern Ireland in recent weeks. So Start Plan being one of them, and the stuff that's going on with the CBI at the minute. So these things can make the press, and at a time when we're all struggling to recruit and retain employees, the last thing you need is a reputation for being a very unfair employer who doesn't do things properly. So that's externally, and internally, you want to give your employees the sense that you're fair, and that things will be done in a way that is transparent and fair and thorough, and that will obviously enhance your reputation internally, because whether we like it or not, very difficult to keep these things always confidential. So I am happy to take questions. No question too small, too silly. Happy to discuss any of the items there, or any particular queries you might have around circumstances that you're currently facing in your own businesses.
Yes, Kiera, thank you so much. Very thorough overview there of some of the pitfalls. Very tricky subject indeed. Yes, please do feel free to use the Q&A chat there, anyone, if you do have a question. We do have one here. Do I have to go through all that process where it is very obvious that the employee is guilty of gross misconduct?
Yes, is the short answer. So I know employers would say to me, oh, this is completely over the top, Kiera, investigation, meeting, appeal, and it needs to be 3 different people, and etc. etc. You do have to do it. You never know what's going to come out of the investigation for a start. So what looks completely obvious, an employee might even have slapped you in the face, but there is a legal requirement, even though it seems ridiculous in those circumstances, to go through that process, and things do come out of it. You might find that employee, I don't know, you might find that it might be very, very difficult to justify not dismissing that employee, but there could be something behind it, and often what looks like even catch an employee with their hand in the till. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation for that. So it is a legal requirement, and I can't think of any cases where the tribunal said that's okay, it's okay that you didn't follow process. Now, there are specific statutory exceptions, and that is, that you don't go through it if the employee is dangerous or there is a real risk to the organisation, but there are very rare circumstances. Now, there have been cases in which employees have made threats and very serious threats, and we didn't follow process, and you could probably stand over that. But generally speaking, don't go with the gut reaction. Take a step back and do your investigation. Yeah, sadly, those boxes always have to be ticked.
Okay, thank you, Kiera. I can't see any other questions coming in there, so I'm very happy to draw it to a close there, and thank Kiera once again, and thank you all for attending, and thanks to SF patron Mills Selig for their guidance on this. So,
no problem at all. And Vincent, just to say, if anyone has anything they think of afterwards, if they want to drop me an email or whatever, happy to follow up with people afterwards.
Super.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Bye bye.